Good afternoon. Welcome to our Mondays with EFTI.Talk and IDEA.Talk. The Eric Friedheim Tourism Institute, Department of Tourism, Hospitality, and Event Management, and Dean Mike Reid, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Council in the College of Health and Human Performance at the University of Florida, are proudly presenting to you EFTI.Talk and IDEA.Talk. It is my great honor to introduce our highest leader in our college, Dr. Mike Reid, who is the Dean of the College of Health and Human Performance at the University of Florida. Dean Reid is recognized for his visionary leadership and research. Dean Reid will give us his welcome and introduce our prestigious panelists for today's program. Dean Reid.
Thank you, Dr. Fu. It's an honor to be here. It's a very kind introduction you gave me. It makes me sound like I'm almost important, but in comparison to the folks I'm about to introduce, that's certainly not true. It's my pleasure to introduce three leaders in academic administration who hold somewhat different roles, who bring somewhat different perspectives to the university experience and are willing to share that with us today. Dr. Jody Gentry is familiar to many of us. She's Vice President of Human Resources at the University of Florida. Jody has 30 years of experience in HR in higher education, and she has a reputation for supporting performance, accountability, and achievement. Currently, she oversees all aspects of HR operations, both for UF faculty and for staff. So her portfolio is very large. Most recently, though, I'm especially indebted to Jody for spearheading the collaboration with the University of Florida Health to keep UF personnel safe and maintain university operations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jody's done a wonderful job, and we all greatly appreciate the work that she and her colleagues have done in that regard. Second, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tonjanita Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs for the University of Alabama System. She's had 20 years of leadership experience in distinguished universities that span the Eastern Seaboard, from Mississippi all the way to New York. After serving as Executive Vice President and CEO for the University of Tennessee System, she moved to the University of Alabama System. In her current role, she directly advises the Chancellor. She also is the primary liaison to academic, student, institutional research and planning, and inclusion officials at 3 different university campuses: University of Alabama, UAB Birmingham, and University of Alabama at Huntsville. And finally, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Shirley, the President Emerita of the University of Memphis. She is known in many quarters as powerful, prepared, and personable. The first woman president of the University of Memphis. She served for 12 years in that role, during which time her successes included a $250 million capital campaign that transformed that university campus, and her ability to more than double extramural funding for research. All of this while obviously maintaining a huge heart for students and academic affairs. So I want to welcome all of these leaders. We are looking forward so much to hearing from you. Dr. Fu, thank you for letting me do the introductions. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Dean Reid. Again, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. What a beautiful day to be together with our 3 wonderful leaders. We have some questions for you all. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Reid, and Dr. Gentry. I'm going to call your first name, if they'll be okay, during our discussion.
Of course.
Thank you. So our first question is, please tell us about at least one barrier or challenge you have overcome to be named to your leadership role. Shirley. Dr. Reid.
Yes, well, I am female, and there had never been a female president at the University of Memphis before me. And the biggest challenge or hurdle I had was getting into the field to be considered, because the search firm said she's not ready. And because we rely so heavily on search firms, if a search firm says you're not ready, the search committee thinks that must be true. But then when a former president of the University of Kentucky, with whom I had worked closely, said, she's more than ready. And in fact, I had asked him, would he recommend me for another job as a dean or a vice chancellor? And his response was no. And I was shocked. He said, no, I think it's time you're a president. So overcoming what search committee firms that are hired think of women as candidates is the barrier that I overcame. And a man, former president, certainly helped me overcome that barrier. And fortunately, the search committee listened to him.
That's very wonderful. Very wise search committee. Thank you so much, Shirley, for the story. How about you, Tanja?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting in terms of what Dr. Raines expressed, having the search firm to say that she was not ready. The biggest barrier I've had to overcome is telling myself that I was not ready. I thought it was quite interesting when I was at the University of Tennessee system. I can remember very vividly the president of the system coming in after we had to suspend a search for the executive vice president and chief operating officer, saying, you know, you are coming to us with this kind of experience from your position at Stony Brook University. He said, you know, would you consider doing this job as we look at what our next steps would be? And I said, what are you smoking? I'm not ready for this. And it was funny. I left that conversation. I went home for lunch. I told my husband what I thought would be a very comical story. And he said, are you crazy? He said, you go back there and tell him that you are ready for this. You will take that job. But it has always been this issue of getting out of my own way to the point where I did not feel like I had to know everything about every role and every responsibility before I determined that I was ready to take on a new role. And, you know, I would think that that would be kind of funny in this conversation because, again, many of the barriers that someone in my position would face would be being an African-American female, coming from a small town. I'm from the Black Belt. And so it was just starting to get out of my own way and then addressing all of the other issues as I took on the role.
Thank you, Tanja. How about you, Jodi?
Well, it's interesting. You know, they do say that women, we will select ourselves out of a role, and men often will select themselves in. It's so interesting that you should share that story because I related to what both of you said. I'm homegrown. I've been at the University of Florida since graduate school. My first job at the University of Florida was a grad assistant. I certainly didn't have any aspirations for moving into this role, but I will say that the fact I tried to prepare myself at later in my career to be competitive if I decided to be interested. I didn't want to get in my own way, but I definitely was not ready for the job. I always say I was probably ready for the leap. And so for me, part of it was overcoming the lack of diversity of my experience. I mean, I've really loved my career at the University of Florida. I'm very grateful for it, but I think there was some skepticism about whether someone who had actually been sort of grown within the University of Florida community, whether I had a diversification of experiences to be able to take the Office of HR to the next level. And so in many respects, it was sort of convincing the search committee and being a kind of trying to prepare myself to be at least somewhat comfortable raising my hand. So I relate very much to what both of you shared, that it was ultimately a function of my being able to position myself to be competitive, given the fact that my background was primarily it's not almost exclusively the University of Florida. It's funny
Thank
how you
you.
can devalue the thing that you cultivate, right?
Yes. So Jodi, you have covered part of our next follow-up question. How has diversity played a role in your career? So Jodi, you want to add any particular? Yes.
Well, I will say, so I went to a small private college called Berea College, and y'all may be aware of it. I mean, so it was established by an abolitionist, and it's the first, I think, first non-segregated coeducational college in the South. And so my upbringing from the very beginning has been launched sort of kind of anchored in this idea of education as being a fundamental transformational piece for people of all types. The logo is God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth. And that very much has, that very much was instilled in me as a very young person. And I believe that has characterized how I thought about my career over the course of it. And at the heart of HR, even though many people often think of human resources being compliance oriented, in my view, it's all about helping create the conditions that allow people to do their very best work. So in that respect, it's a through line of my own personal commitment, is this idea of diversity and inclusion. Although over the years we've used different terms, it's an important part of who I am from the very beginning of my kind of evolution into becoming an adult.
Thank you, Jodi. Dr. Rains?
Yes, thank you for Jodi's response. I know Berea College well because I spent 6 years in Kentucky, and Berea has a great reputation for its values. I think all of us bring what our values are to the position. When I came to the University of Memphis, even though Memphis is approximately 48% white and 52% African-American, the student population was only 19% African-American. And so giving opportunities to students and opening the door for more students was an important part. But before I could open that door, I had to have leaders who were devoted to opening the door for achievement of African-American and minority students. And there were no minority people on the vice president at the vice president's role. So I was able to appoint the first African-American vice president for business and finance, and also the first African-American vice president woman for student affairs. And they instantly became leaders and recruiters and so forth. And the other part was the person who was responsible for making sure that we had an open search was a woman who was on our staff, who was then called the Equal Opportunity Officer. These days, I bet if she were still in that role, she would have the title of Diversity and Inclusion. But Michelle Banks, I moved to reporting directly to me so that I had the opportunity to look at internal searches for people. Actually, I went from, at first it was only deans and vice chancellors and major directors. And then I decided to ask her to report to me about searches for chairs, because we know that one builds experience from being a good chair, from being a dean, or serving in other administrative roles. So I'm telling you a lot here, but it's appointing people who are, it's recruiting students who are minority students, and then creating an inclusive environment for them. It is making sure that the people who serve on your immediate leadership team represent that diversity. When I arrived, there were no women on my team, 0 women on my team. 12 years later, when I left, we were the majority. And there are lots of stories I could tell about that, but I won't. But you can call me later and I'll tell you some funny ones. I'll only say this. It's when I sent the athletic director out for coffee for the whole leadership panel that I realized that we really had achieved a lot more diversity. But anyway, there we go. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Rains. Thank you so much for your legendary stories. You were the first woman president for University of Memphis, and also you have been there for 12 years as a president and continuously been our role model. That's so wonderful. Dr. Johnson, would you like to add on how has diversity played a role in your career? And plus, how did you make your organization more diverse?
Well, I thought it was kind of interesting. I wish we could have had someone from Berea here, because I think it was such a, when Jody mentioned her academic experience, it reminded me that Berea was one of the first colleges to recruit me as a high school student. And I can remember having in my senior book, having the little logo and information that they sent to me. And it was so exciting that they could be interested in someone like myself from a small rural town. And so when I thought about the question as you were asking it here, it did take me back to my academic experience, because I was thinking as the child of parents who had attended HBCUs, really that was going to be the direction I was going in. I fully intended to go to Howard University, and I felt like that was an environment where I would meet people that were very much like me, that had similar experiences. And lo and behold, my English teacher, who also served as our newspaper advisor at my high school, she recommended me for a minority journalism workshop at the University of Alabama. And I thought, not sure that this is someplace that I want to go, but there was there were limited slots for this particular program. And I got selected, and I thought, oh, well, I'm surely not going to waste that opportunity. And from that opportunity, I ended up receiving a New York Times scholarship to the university. And so that led me to UA for the first time. And so it was interesting because that experience gave me the confidence that I could engage and interact in this traditionally white environment with the support of individuals who understood some of the challenges that I might experience as a college student. Oddly enough, I'm a third generation college student, so this idea of going to school was not foreign to me. But when you grow up in a very small community, you get used to certain ways of doing things, certain people, and you want to go where you can feel a level of comfort. But just spending that time at the University of Alabama gave me a sense that I could maneuver in that environment, even if I had to be in places where I might be the only one in a group or one of a few. And so I thought that was very interesting, because I did not know at the time that was going to prepare me for my first job. My first job, I was the only African-American in the newsroom. And there I was thinking, how in the world am I gonna make this work? And it was a very positive experience. After a couple of years there, I ended up coming back to the University of Alabama they wanted to diversify their news bureau. And so it was a great opportunity. And I did not feel like I was coming into an environment where I was going to have to be worried about not being able to find my place in that space. And so as I thought about what has happened since that point, I have been the youngest person around the table in terms of being on a university cabinet. In many cases, I've been the only female. And, those are some interesting times when you're sitting there. I was teasing with Dr. Rains a moment ago. She was referencing about being young. And I said, I'm just well preserved. I feel like I've been in this space for so long with individuals who really seeing someone as a female in some of these cabinet level roles, being as young as I was at many points, And I can remember situations where I've been given different responsibilities, and people would say, well, we're not going to increase your salary that much right now. You have the potential to be a vice president one day. And do you know how long it took me to be a vice president? And I'm thinking, where in the world is this? So, I have realized that you engage in a lot of very conflicting types of conversations with people about who you are, where you're coming from. And it was very good to be able to be comfortable in my own skin moving in and out of these roles. And so I've been so as you talk about how do you make your organization more diverse, or how do you champion that diversity with an organization, I'm very sensitive to recognizing that when people are coming into roles, they're not going to think like me. They don't have to think like me. They're not going to look like me. They may be much younger than I am. I can always remember having a chancellor once tell me, he said, you look great on paper, and I know I should hire you for this job, but I have shoes older than you. And I thought to myself, no, this is not someplace I want to work. And so I've been very deliberate in terms of, as I looked at diversity across our organizations, thinking about all the ways people bring diversity to that organization and the value of that, and how to make people feel comfortable and feel like they belong, and engage in ways that it's not just about me, and I'm not just looking for a mirror image of myself when I'm trying to create a better environment within the organization that I serve.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Definitely, you stand tall and shoulders back, be confident, and you know who you are. That's what the inspirational statements you are providing. How about you, Jody? I think this question, our UF faculty, staff, students, we really love to hear from you. How did you make your organization more diverse?
Well, so, such an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that we have put in place that I think is really critical is that we have put in place a strategic talent group to serve as a search committee, going back to Dr. Rain's comment about how we higher ed often really relies on search firms. And that can be actually it can be a help, but it also can be a very expensive hurdle that you could insert in the way of talented people in your organization and outside. And so one of the things that my team and I have done over the past few years is we put in place a strategic talent group that's positioned to be able to source candidates and to do so in an inclusive way, with an eye on really advancing the university with wonderful candidates from a range of different places with intentionality. So for us, bumping up our skill set as HR professionals to really serve as the kind of consultants that we know the organization needs, applying inclusive hiring principles to support that search, and being very intentional about how we cast the net. We know that this idea of really having inclusive process practices at the very beginning of a hire really increases the chances and the likelihood of having diverse applicants and candidates upon selection. And so while that's one small example, for me, I know in my profession, we are responsible for a lot of systems that can either encourage success or get in the way. And we're trying to be really thoughtful about the systems that we're responsible for and adjusting them to make sure that they're as inclusive as they possibly can be, given the fact that we all have biases and sometimes don't even know what we don't know. My team and I are working really hard to look at a range of different ways to do that, to promote inclusion. So that's an example. And I think it builds very nicely to Dr. Rain's comment, which is her obstacle was the search firm. I'm like, well, we built our own, because we knew that, right, you can spend a lot of money and never even know the wonderful people who sort of said, I'm interested, or that sometimes it's to reach out to say, hey, are you interested? And even if they say to you, what have you been smoking? That we say, no, we really mean you. So it's designed to really help with both of those. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing and continuing to do.
Thank you, Dr. Gentry. Dr. Rains, would you like to tell us more about how did you get candidates from underrepresented communities?
Well, I found that in certain fields, it's easier to get candidates. And to say that we are going to have an open search, that, and for me as the person who had to approve these search pools, to say, I'm not going to approve a pool that does not have some females and minorities included in that pool. And often some of the fields would say, but we don't have any. And I would say, go look for them, because quite often they're not the people who come to mind first, but they can be found. And then if we could talk to them about the possibility of joining us, that was great. We didn't want someone who wasn't qualified. I know that always comes up, but in reality, there are many qualified women and many qualified minorities in many fields. There is a shortage in the STEM fields and others. So one of the things we did that perhaps works with Jody's comments earlier is to identify some women and minorities who are in the doctoral programs at your institution and groom them for opportunities that are going to be coming up, or make an opportunity for them. That became another avenue. We found that to be true even with the doctorate in nursing and trying to expand the nursing field. We did not have people in that intermediate zone of people who had been administrators in nursing. So some of the fields that you think it's easy to find people, it is not, but finding an alternative way to either find them, search further, better, longer, wider, and also not be afraid to search in Canada or other places. But then if you can't find the people, grow your own, but make sure that the opportunities you give them are going to allow them to be highly successful when they are among your colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Rains. How about you, Dr. Johnson?
Well, I tell you, I love what I've heard so far, because these have been very critical components of assisting with finding underrepresented candidates. A couple of other things that I would just add to that I know have worked well for me is, one, putting your network to work. I have never hesitated to, when I know there's a job coming and I know I have connections with individuals within these communities where we are looking for candidates, say, look, here's a position description, spread it far and wide, getting on the telephone to call people to say, look, I know you may be content where you are, but here's something that's coming up, something that you might have an interest in. If you're not interested, pass it on to someone else in your network. So really putting that network to work. Another thing that I thought was very simple, and a lot of times you just kind of overlook it, is really doing an assessment of how you're promoting yourself and what you're putting out there as an organization. I've been at a couple of institutions that decided to take a deeper look at how they were describing their institutions, the type of language that was being used in when they were putting out advertisements, because what they discovered in many instances when they checked the profile of the institution with even internal underrepresented members of the community, people would say, if I weren't already here, this would not attract me to this place. This does not sound like some place that would be a good fit for me or my family. So really being able to take a look at how well we're talking about who we are and making sure that the language that we're using in trying to attract underrepresented minorities and underrepresented populations, that it's an attractive proposition for them to explore coming to work at your organization.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I would like to come back to Dr. Rains. Would you tell us and share your experiences and your advice? What is the most difficult part of implementing an inclusion, diversity, equity, and access program?
I think the most difficult part is to say it's for everybody. People will say, well, that's for the equal opportunity officer, or that's for the diversity officer, or that's for the HR training. And getting the word out that this is a program for the whole of the university. One of the best ways for us, in addition to the faculty, was the student government. Having student government elect minorities and women, and then they talk about creating an inclusive environment on campus was a tremendous asset. Then there are some departments that are so well known for being inclusive and inviting. It may sound as a surprise, but the philosophy department at the University of Memphis was one of the most diverse. And in many places, it's one of the least diverse. But the department made it a source of pride that they were very diverse. Our difficulty became that people, particularly the Ivy Leagues, would come and raid our department all the time. So we had to be sure when we were raided to not let that stand in the way, to say we're still going to be a very inclusive and diverse department. But finding the ones on campus, the departments that are very inclusive, and making sure you highlight them as departments. And I would say, when I found a very successful researcher who was a minority, and if she were a minority and I could take her with me to some community organization, and when I was asked to say a few words about the university, I would mention her and her research. And that upped the level of attention from the community of seeing it as a place where the faculty who were diverse were going to be recognized and rewarded. Now, it is a struggle to make it a university-wide, but I think it initiatives, and be willing to have the hard conversations. We, Dr. Rosie Bingham, who was our vice president for student affairs, had a series of conversations using the common ground format, and our history ourselves was another initiative that we had that was very inclusive, but having real conversation about what needs to change is important. So it's wonderful to be able to brag on what you've done, but having a real conversation that opens the door for people to say, how can we get better? And you know, I'm a developmentalist. I really believe that no matter how good you are, you can get better.
Thank you, Dr. Rains. Vice President Gentry, any insights on this topic?
Well, I will say that I do think that often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about it in terms of the lens of recruitment, and that's certainly an important part of it. But for sure, what you want to do is really look at whether you are able to cultivate a sense of belonging throughout the organization, and whether people really are positioned to do their very best work. And that's hard to do. It's hard to do it in any context. I mean, it maps back to the quality of your managers and leaders, and whether they're prepared to engage in the challenge and to see their role in helping others to kind of run alongside faculty and staff. Often in higher ed, we promote people because they're smart. And while that's necessary, it's not sufficient. It's a real skill set to be able to lead and manage well, and to do it in a way that's inclusive, that really allows people to capitalize on their skills and aptitudes in a way that, you know, sort of allows them to excel and to completely connect with the organization. So, I mean, I think it's difficult because, well, so the short answer would be, if it were easy, we would already be there. But I think honestly, it's the kind of thing where you have to have both patience, but also a sense of urgency. It's an odd thing, right? It can't be the kind of thing where you hear people talk about the pipeline, and I think it's overused. I think it happens certainly in certain cases, but I think that can be overused as an excuse. So you've got to be urgent, you got to push, but there has to be patience as well. The workforce doesn't change overnight, right? You've got people who we hope that come to your university and stay 20 or 30 years. Students, you have a little bit more of a turnover, but often what your organization is really an artifact of hiring practices that existed 20 or 30 years ago. And so what you really do have to see is every new hire through a lens of opportunity for that person and for the organization, and to be really intentional about that. But that means that depending on how much turnover you have in a year or how many new positions you have, you really have to kind of, again, both approach it with a sense of urgency, but also with an eye on the long game, that the way that you shape cultures through experiences, right? People have experiences that are positive. They have experiences of success. They have experiences, and that then begins to shape what they think, which then shapes their beliefs and drives different actions. And that's a long-term game.
Thank you, Jody. Dr. Johnson.
Well, I think Jody hit on something that is very critical here, this whole notion of urgency and patience. And because sometimes we want to see change and productivity overnight, and we fail to recognize some of the long-standing counterproductive cultural norms that have been in place that you just can't change overnight. And so really the difficulty in implementing many of these programs in this space is trying to change these long-standing barriers that you're always encountering. I think the other thing that often has puts a barrier in the way in terms of implementation has to do with measuring success, and somehow we can confuse activity with accomplishments. And so I'm constantly mindful of the fact that we can be busy doing things in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and access space, having programs and all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, do we know what success looks like? And oftentimes what we're trying to accomplish in this space, you can't really count. And so it goes down to the very fabric of the organization. The other thing that I think is a major factor in terms of implementation has to do with the internal and external politics that's often involved in moving this issue. And I know that Dr. Raines, was well familiar with Tennessee politics, as issues of diversity and inclusion were at play even during the time when I was at the University of Tennessee system, where it is, you're trying to do all the right things, and you hear a legislator say, well, how many is enough? And you just sort of freeze in your tracks, and you realize that so much of what you're struggling with in terms of implementing effective programs and making change really has a lot to do with the amount of change that the powers that be will tolerate at the time that you're trying to move things. So politics can be a major concern as you're trying to implement programs in this space.
Thank you so much. So we talk about strategies, urgency, and politics, and the strengths. So this is a follow-up. What role can leaders or managers play in creating an inclusive environment, Dr. Johnson?
Well, I think first of all, you have to really start as an advocate and being willing to vocalize your support and what you believe in. Another thing that you have to do is to identify and address your own personal biases and preconceived ideas, because before you can really be a part of leading a more inclusive environment, you have to deal with all of your own baggage that you bring to this conversation. And it doesn't matter what you look like, you come with biases and issues, and I think you have to get to that point where you're beyond that. Leading by example, I think, is another thing that you have to be able to do. as a leader, you've got to show some courage in this space and to be able to recommend, support, and engage in activities and practices and behaviors that demonstrate that you're committed to an inclusive environment. And if it doesn't start at the top, it's surely going to be much more difficult for those who are somewhere in the middle of the ranks or in the lower ranks trying to make change if, as leaders, we're not out up there really being the strongest advocates for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Vice President Gentry.
So I agree completely that it really does start with some serious self-reflection. What I found out or realized about myself is I had a tendency, and still do, to tend to talk about things in terms of helping all people, right? We put in place a paid parental leave program, and I remember I was at an event similar to this, and someone said, well, I see this as sort of a women's issue, blah, blah, and for sure, it certainly does. Just there's a positive effect, but I said, I kind of see it as a human issue. And I realized in that moment, while both of those terms were true, right? Yes, it certainly is very supportive of women in the workplace, and disproportionately so. And yes, it benefits all of us as a human. But my tendency to kind of equalize things was getting in the way of people actually hearing kind of my commitment to diversity and inclusion. Like it sort of watered it down. So I've asked for help from my colleagues. It reflects for me how I talk about the workplace, and I've asked them to hold me accountable. I'm like, help me tease out the effort that we're making so that people can see the impact that these best practices have on diversity and inclusion in a more intentional way. It begins with sort of that self-reflection. I think all of us, to your point, Dr. Johnson, no matter what we look like, no matter our background, if we don't start with that self-reflection, we can inadvertently get in our way, and most likely will. And even if you are doing that ruthless self-assessment, like I like to talk about in lots of different ways, you still need really good colleagues to kind of help hold you accountable and to hold up the mirror when you stumble, or you just need some help. I think broadly, and if you're I think most of the folks who are participating today at the University of Florida, we do have an inclusive leadership workshop that I'm really proud of. And it talks a little bit about that we need to sort of recognize the uniqueness of each person and the belongingness of each person. You do that by creating a safe environment, right, where you really work hard to build trust. You make sure everyone's heard, right? Really focusing on your communication skills, making sure that people feel known and valued through coaching. And being really treated fairly through, being thoughtful about accountability. And to me, it goes back to an earlier comment I make. I think that we all have a duty to challenge ourselves in terms of seeing leadership and management as an actual skill set that we can cultivate. And to Dr. Rain's point, that we're never done, that we're always developing, that we really are continuing to challenge ourselves to be the best person we can be reflective of the biases we bring, whether they're conscious or subconscious, that implicit role that they occupy as part of our software. And then also really thoughtful about skills development, because I think we all can learn and do better every day.
Thank you, Jodi. Dr. Rains, you are our leader. What would be your advice for the leaders?
Well, I did like what Jodi was saying about the training. I thought that was the individual points were absolutely right on. I think as leaders, having the right people around you makes such a difference. And because I was so fortunate to have wonderful minority and female leaders around me, and I was willing to listen, frankly, all good ideas do not come from on high. In fact, there should be a wonderful exchange that occurs in leadership councils and so forth. I wanted to bring up another point that we've talked about faculty, we've talked about administrators, but our universities are run by wonderful directors and executives of programs and staff who have ranking systems all of their own as well. And one of the ways that I tried very hard, and maybe Jodi would appreciate this since she was appointed from within, was when there was a senior director or executive position, and there were lots of people who had worked there many years, at the university to look within and see if we could promote them, because the tendency had been at the highest levels of these executive and directorships among the professional staff was to go outside, much like we did for faculty. I remember one time we were promoting someone who was director of the student program that we'll just call student engagement. It had another name. And he had been very active and was one of the most popular people, and could say no to students, but said yes to students, and built these wonderful opportunities for students. And when it came time for an executive director, he didn't apply because he was internal. And I said to him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, I'm not saying you'll get the job, but I'm saying you should apply. So we often have a much more diverse and frankly inclusive arena of professionals on our campuses who are not faculty and are not higher level administrators. But when we give higher level staff an opportunity, it sends a tremendous message throughout the whole of the university.
Thank you, Dr. Rains. Our audience, we are going to open up for Q&A. So please type your question in the Q&A box on the screen. This is one question for Dr. Johnson. What are some ways to expose students to different cultures in meaningful ways?
Well, in terms of students, I think providing them with opportunities to collaborate in developing solutions to some of our problems in this space, I've always found to be a very fruitful exercise. A lot of times we struggle with issues trying to figure out how we're going to come up with something to help our students, but we fail to engage them in the process where they're coming together to talk about some of the issues. And we hear some of the real world things that our students are struggling with. Along with this, one of the things I'm reminded of is just going back to the classroom where, as an administrator, I try to teach at every institution because I think it's always a good opportunity to keep your finger on the pulse of things. Most recently, I've been teaching in the higher education administration area. And one of the things I would do is to provide students with an opportunity to explore academic issues from through a variety of lenses. So I try to find something, say, presidential derailment, and look at that through different types of institutions. So I would take a common issue and give students and assign students. Now you're going to look at a particular example from the perspective of an HBCU or from a traditionally white institution or a tribal college. Give them that opportunity, looking at some of the same components, but trying to understand the different dynamics that are in play when they're trying to see what really happened here. What are some of the opportunities that we might learn in this environment where we are, but because I may not be as familiar with HBCUs, I wouldn't have taken a look at something like that. So it really comes down to exposing students and others to look at life through a different set of lenses besides the one that they're constantly looking through.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Jodi?
Well, I'm not really an expert on students, but I will say that I think for me that notion of encouraging travel is such an important piece. It was such a heartbreak this past year for the study abroad programs to be halted. But I know in my own experience, going someplace where you're the other is a life-changing experience, right? When you're the only person in a sort of a Japanese family resort, and you and your partner are it's like the first time in my life where I was the other, and you don't forget that. It shapes you, it influences your thinking. And I think about learning about other cultures and how powerful that must be on students. And at Berea, that was my first travel experience. They sent me away for a month and it changed my life. And I can't help but think that that's a similar experience for our students today.
Thank you. Dr. Rains?
I would also add about travel is to be certain that you and your fundraisers are seeking money for people who are not able to afford travel or to have that opportunity. Many of the students who would have had great experiences traveling at the University of Memphis could not have afforded to be away from a part-time job or to be away from family responsibilities or whatever. So in terms of international travel, being certain that we recruit some money to add to that pot so that it's possible for many people to be away. And I'm sure Jody had a great experience through Berea College because they always made sure that students did not lack financial resources to support them, but that is not the way it is in most other international travel organizations.
Thank you. FYI, I'm the department chair in tourism, hospitality, event management. So definitely our department within our college of health and human performance, we offer lots of study abroad. And again, how fun it is. Our major, even our dissertation, we study travel tourism, event.
Right,
and
yes.
Yes, so in terms of globalization, inclusion, diversity, so this is celebration department, and we are very happy, and definitely that's how we make a connection. I remember 20 years ago, my first job, my former department head asked me if I will take the offer for University of Tennessee, and I said, no, I'm on my way back to Taiwan, and she said, well, if you take this offer, you are going to bring the world to the classroom. So that's the key statement. I decided to stay.
That's beautiful. That's
Wonderful.
beautiful, right? That's beautiful. That's a lovely. I'm so glad you shared that. That's a lovely thing.
Yeah, and that one statement changed my life, and I've been building the relationship with students, with you all. I'm the luckiest person on earth. Love my job. Travel tourism. I'm having fun every day. And so do our faculty member.
I love it when a University of Florida faculty member says that.
Love it. So here's one question from one of our attendees. I'd love to hear what each of your internal thresholds are for saying no to opportunities in order to keep your sanity. Dr. Johnson, you want to go first?
I will start there because no was initially never in my vocabulary. I would say yes to everything just because, one, I didn't want anyone upset with me, and I just always felt like I needed to be active and busy. And what I realized that I was saying yes to so many things that it was hard really to focus in on any one thing because you were just going from one thing to the next. And so one thing that I've had to learn to do, particularly when you are the only one in a particular space. You know, I have been in those situations where I was the only African American, and every time you look up, someone was calling you for some opportunity. And I had to start really beginning to introduce folks to other people who could engage in processes on committees and that sort of thing. But, you know, the one thing that I try to use as my threshold really is, what kind of impact can you have in this space? Is this something that you're passionate about? The one thing that it is hard for me to say no to really would be opportunities to connect with people, because I know some people, I tell folks all the time, the greatest resource I have is my time. So anyone who is interested in wanting to share ideas and thoughts, just wanting to talk to someone or have a connection with someone just to bounce off ideas, my calendar is always open. So that's the place where I can't say no. I've learned that the threshold for engaging in every activity or opportunity that comes along, you just can't say yes to everything. So you just have to be selective about what you're passionate about and what you can impact.
Thank you. Jody, you want to?
Well, don't ask me. I struggle with this. I'm thinking Dr. Johnson's right. Impact is the way to evaluate it, but I really do struggle with this. This is a life challenge for me. I will almost always say yes, even when I probably shouldn't, and it's a struggle for me. So I would be a hypocrite to give you words of wisdom, but Dr. Rains probably has some thoughtful things, and I can't wait to hear it.
Dr. Rains, you're on the spotlight.
I appreciate Dr. Johnson's viewpoint and wish I were better at that as well, Jody. But when you're a university president, there are expectations of you as a person, and then there are expectations of you as a role in a role, and then there are expectations of you from the community, and deciding whether this is something I should do or I must do because I'm the president of the university, or they really need me within the community to represent the university, became the issue. My husband and I used to go to everything together, and then we devised this calendar that said must go, should go, don't want to go, and and let him say there were things that he just did not want to go to, and I won't tell you what they were, and there were things that he must go to, and things that he had a question mark that he could go to. And I think actually his calendar probably would have been a good device for me as well, because there's some things you just don't want to go to. And then there are things that you really should go to. And then there are things that, you know, maybe would expand your horizons in the community. And I joined a lot of community boards that I wasn't sure at the beginning that I should have been a part of, but I felt the university should be a part of them. And I wound up being the first woman chair of the Chamber of Commerce for Memphis. Now, and it had been in existence for 150 years. So I couldn't quite believe some of the doors that opened for me, and that I changed the organization because I was there, not so much because it was me, but was because it was a woman. There was an academic involved in community initiatives. So I think there are a lot of sides to this, and the personal side is the one that I, like Dr. Johnson and Jody, have struggled with. Am I saying no because of what I personally believe and think? But as a president, there were many things I felt I must say so for the university, and other things that I felt like the presence in the community would make a difference. But now that I'm President Emerita, the past president, I would have to say that is still an issue for me personally. What am I going to say yes to? Because if you're a new past president of a university who moves into a community, my goodness. So and they want you on everything. And I had to say, for a year, I'm not going to accept anything. Well, one of the pediatricians in town knew how much I cared about people with disabilities. And so he said, well, I'm sorry, I've already put you on the board of the Emory Valley Center. So other than that, I managed to wait a year before I said yes and really weighed what I wanted.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful 1 year and 1 hour. And the 1 hour feels like 1 minute. And I really want to thank you. You all have said yes to our today's program. We are very honored. What a privilege to have you, Vice President Gentry, Dr. Rains, and Dr. Johnson. We are so grateful for your insight, for your advice, for your leadership stories, sharing for your visions, and for what you have done in the past, now, and in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. Our audience, thank you for spending time with us. Thank you. You all have a wonderful day.